This is a dramatization. My name is Eleanor Sinclair, and I was sitting at a table in the back of the ballroom next to the catering station when my brother raised a crystal flute of champagne to toast his bride. He was the sun, and everyone in that room was a planet caught in his orbit. Dr. Julian Sinclair, the golden boy. My parents beamed from the head table, their faces shining with a pride so potent it was almost a physical presence in the room. His bride, Charlotte, a woman whose family owned half the city's commercial real estate, looked at him with the kind of adoration usually reserved for saints and rock stars. Julian, ever the performer, let the silence hang for a moment before he began. "To my beautiful wife," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "To our families, the Brennans and the Sinclairs, for bringing us together." He went through the motions, thanking his new in-laws for their generosity, thanking our parents for their unwavering support, thanking his best man for a lifetime of friendship. I watched him, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the fabric of my simple navy dress, bought on clearance, feeling coarse and inadequate under the glittering chandeliers. Then his eyes found me. It wasn't a warm glance. It was a cursory, almost obligatory acknowledgement. "And I should also thank my sister, Eleanor," he said, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. The room turned to look at me, this forgotten moon in the far corner. Ellie has always been there, in her own way. A murmur of polite, confused appreciation went through the crowd. He continued, the smile widening. "She's lived a much simpler life than I have. One of hard work and, well, simplicity. It's a world away from the rigors of medical science, from the pressures of residency and research, a world I'm not sure she could even comprehend." He paused, letting the insult land, wrapped as it was in the guise of a compliment. "But she helped me in the beginning, and for that, I'm grateful. We're so glad you could be here, Ellie, to see what all that simple hard work contributed to." He turned back to his bride, his dismissal complete. He raised his glass. "To the future!" The room echoed him. "To the future!" I didn't raise my glass. I just sat there, the heat rising in my cheeks, the sting of public humiliation a familiar ache. He had done it. He had taken my sacrifice, the 10 years of my life I had poured into his future, and reduced it to a footnote, an embarrassing anecdote about his humble beginnings. He called me simple, an object of pity, an outsider who couldn't possibly understand the magnificent world I had paid for him to enter. He didn't know that the woman sitting in the back of the room, the one he had just erased, had already rewritten the ending to his story. And the man who was about to deliver the final chapter was sitting just 3 tables away, waiting for his cue. Our family wasn't always like this. Before the collapse, we were comfortable. My father ran a successful consulting firm, my mother managed the household with an iron fist and a perfect smile, and Julian and I were given every opportunity. He was always the star, brilliant, charming, athletic. I was the quiet one, the reader, the planner. While he was scoring goals on the soccer field, I was winning debate tournaments. While he was charming his teachers into giving him extensions, I was finishing my assignments a week early. My achievements were noted with a pleasant nod. His were celebrated with parties. He was the investment. I was the dividend, expected to be reliable and quietly productive. I just finished my paralegal certification and was saving up for law school when my father's firm went under. It wasn't a slow decline. It was a catastrophic failure. A key client defaulted, a bad investment came due, and overnight, everything was gone. The house, the cars, the savings, we were adrift. It was the same month Julian received his acceptance letter to a top-tier medical school. I remember the family meeting in the cramped apartment we'd moved into. The air was thick with despair. My father looked like a ghost. My mother's perfect facade had cracked. And Julian was panicking. His dream was slipping through his fingers. "There's no way," my father said, his voice hollow. "The loans we could get wouldn't even cover a semester." My mother started to cry, quiet, desperate sobs. Julian, your whole life. You've worked so hard. He had. I couldn't deny that. He was smart. But he'd never truly worked for anything. It had always been easy for him. This was the first real obstacle of his life. I looked at the acceptance letter on the table. I looked at my own law school brochures tucked away in my bag, and I made a decision. I'll do it, I said. The three of them looked at me as if I'd just started speaking a foreign language. I'll pay for it, I clarified. I have my paralegal degree. I can get a good job. I can pick up shifts waitressing at night. I've done the math. If I live frugally, I can cover his tuition, his books, his rent, all of it. My father stared. Eleanor, that's hundreds of thousands of dollars. That's your entire life for the next decade. It's Julian's future, I said, looking at my brother. We make a deal. I fund his education, every penny. When he's an established doctor, he pays me back, with interest, so I can go to law school then. Julian's eyes, red-rimmed and desperate, lit up with hope. He rushed over and hugged me. Ellie, you'd do that? You'd really do that for me? I would, I said. But it's a business deal, Julian, not a gift. Of course, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Anything you want. I'll pay you back double. My parents wept with gratitude. I was St. Eleanor, the savior of the family. They praised my sacrifice, my selflessness, my love for my brother, for about a month. Then it just became the new normal. Hit subscribe if you believe that silence can be a weapon. Comment your city and share this with someone who's been underestimated. My life became a meticulously scheduled cycle of exhaustion. From 8 to 5, I was a paralegal at a small firm, drafting documents, organizing case files, and doing legal research. My boss, Mr. Abernathy, appreciated my precision but paid me a fraction of what I was worth. From 6 to midnight, 4 nights a week, I was a waitress at a fine dining restaurant, the Candelabra. My feet ached, my back burned, and I smiled through condescending remarks from patrons for a few extra dollars in tips. I lived in a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat. The spin cycle was my lullaby. I ate pasta with butter, day-old bread from the restaurant, and I became an expert at turning a single chicken into a week's worth of meals. Every spare dollar was documented in a ledger, a black hardbound book, and then wired to Julian's account. Tuition payments, rent for his spacious apartment near campus, funds for textbooks that cost more than my monthly grocery bill, even money for his networking dinners. I never missed a payment. For 8 years. Meanwhile, Julian thrived. He sent photos of himself at medical school mixers, in his new scrubs, studying in a sun-drenched library. My parents would tack these photos to the refrigerator in their own small apartment, their faces glowing. "Look at him, Ellie," my mother would say during our weekly perfunctory phone calls. "He's going to be such an important man. Aren't you proud?" "I am," I'd say, looking at my own reflection in the darkened window of my apartment, my eyes tired, my hands raw from hot plates and dishwater. The shift began in his final year. He met Charlotte Brennan. Suddenly, the photos he sent included her. They were on a yacht, at a ski resort in Aspen, at a charity gala. Her family's money wrapped around him like a cashmere coat. My weekly wire transfers, once received with a grateful text, now went unacknowledged. He started calling me less. When I did get him on the phone, he sounded distracted, impatient. The first crack in the facade appeared when he discussed his residency interviews. He'd been accepted into a highly competitive surgical program. "It was the paper I published," he said, his voice filled with self-importance. "The one on neuroplasticity in trauma recovery. It made a huge splash." I remembered paying for the journal submission fees. "That's wonderful, Julian. I'd love to read it sometime." "Oh, it's very technical," he said dismissively. "You wouldn't really get it, but it's the reason I'm set for life." The illusion finally shattered 6 months before the wedding. He called to tell me he and Charlotte were engaged. I was happy for him, genuinely. Then I asked, "So, have you thought about a timeline for our agreement? Once you're an attending, We can start the repayment plan." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Ellie, about that," he said, his voice suddenly slick and uncomfortable. "Charlotte and I were talking, and her father is handling our finances. He said that money, it was a gift for a brother. It would be unseemly to treat it as a debt." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A gift? Julian, we had a deal. I have ledgers. I have bank statements. I put my life on hold for you." "Don't be so dramatic," he scoffed. "You were working those jobs anyway. Look, I'm incredibly grateful, but you need to let it go. It's in the past. We're moving forward." That was it. 10 years of my life gone, dismissed. He didn't just break his promise. He tried to rewrite history, to erase the truth of my sacrifice and recast it as a quaint family favor he no longer had to acknowledge. But he had forgotten who I was. I wasn't just a waitress. I was a paralegal. And for a paralegal, documentation is everything. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now back to the story. My grief lasted for exactly 24 hours. Then, the cold, methodical anger set in. The part of my brain that was trained to find discrepancies, to follow paper trails, to build a case, woke from its long slumber. He said his career was built on that groundbreaking paper. Fine, I would start there. I still had access to his university online payment portal. He'd never bothered to change the password from the one I'd set up for him years ago. It was an oversight born of pure arrogance. He didn't see me as a threat, so he saw no need for caution. I logged in and started combing through 8 years of itemized tuition and fee statements. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a loose thread. And I found one. For 4 consecutive semesters during his 3rd and 4th years, there was a recurring charge listed under academic disciplinary fees. It was for several $1,000s each time. I had paid it without a second thought, assuming it was some standard university cost. But the label was specific. Disciplinary. Why would Julian, the star student, have disciplinary fees? I cross-referenced the dates with my old ledgers. Those were the semesters he was supposedly doing the core research for his famous paper. The timeline felt wrong. This was the first piece of the puzzle, the first hint that the story he told the world was a fabrication. My next step was the paper itself. I found it published in a prestigious medical journal online. The Role of BDNF in Post-Traumatic Axonal Regeneration by Julian A. Sinclair. It was dense, brilliant, and as he'd predicted, largely incomprehensible to a layperson. But I wasn't a layperson. I was a researcher. I started breaking it down, not by its scientific merit, but by its structure, its citations, its data sets. I spent my nights not in the restaurant, but in the law library using their databases. I focused on the bibliography. He cited dozens of studies, but one in particular stood out. A preliminary study from a small university in Germany, published 2 years prior. The author was a Dr. Anja Schmidt. I found her paper. It was a foundational piece, less conclusive than Julian's, but the methodology, the phrasing, even the way the data was presented, was strikingly similar. It was like looking at a pencil sketch next to a finished oil painting. Julian's paper wasn't an evolution of her work. It was a direct, expanded copy. He had taken her research, added a larger data set, and passed it off as his own revolutionary discovery. He hadn't just plagiarized a few sentences. He had stolen the entire intellectual framework of a fellow scientist. The arrogance was breathtaking. He had gambled on the obscurity of the original work, confident that no one in his circle would ever connect the dots. Now I understood the disciplinary fees. He'd been caught, not by the journal, but by the university. They must have discovered it internally. But why hadn't they expelled him? A scandal involving their star student, the one they'd been promoting to donors, would have been a public relations nightmare. So they buried it. They fined him, put him on some kind of internal probation, and let him graduate quietly, pushing the problem down the road. They protected the institution at the expense of academic integrity. I had the what and the how. Now I needed the proof and the witness. I reached out to Dr. Anja Schmidt in Germany. I sent her a calm, professional email introducing myself as an independent legal researcher looking into academic integrity. I attached both her paper and Julian's. Her reply came within hours. It was furious, heartbroken, and in perfect, scathing English. She told me she had suspected for a year that her work had been stolen, but had no resources to fight a major American university. She had been a postdoctoral fellow at the time. He had been the golden boy from a prestigious institution. No one would have listened to her. She gave me her blessing to use her correspondence in any way I saw fit. My final move was to contact the dean of the medical school, Dr. Alistair Finch. I looked him up. He was new, appointed just after Julian had graduated. He had a reputation as a reformer, a stickler for ethics. He hadn't been part of the original cover-up. I requested a meeting presenting myself as a family member with a grave concern about a recent graduate. If Sweet Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple bucks a month keeps these stories coming. Links below. And hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now back to the story. I sat in Dr. Finch's stately office, a simple folder on my lap. He was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes that didn't miss a thing. He listened patiently as I laid out my story. Not the family drama, but the facts. I presented the tuition statements with the disciplinary fees highlighted. I showed him the side-by-side comparison of the two papers, with dozens of passages color-coded to show the direct lifts. I concluded with the printed-out email from Dr. Schmidt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I presented my case as if I were submitting a brief. When I was finished, he was silent for a full minute, his steepled fingers covering his mouth. He looked at the evidence, then back at me. "Ms. Sinclair," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "what you have uncovered is a profound institutional failure, one that I was not aware of, but one that I am now obligated to rectify." "I'm not asking you to ruin him," I said, and it was true. I wasn't motivated by pure revenge. This was about justice, about the truth. I'm asking you to hold him accountable. His entire career is built on a lie. He is going to be a surgeon. People's lives will be in his hands, hands that belong to a fraud. Dr. Finch nodded slowly. The residency board must be notified. The journal that published the paper must be notified. And the university must rescind his degree. There is no other ethical choice. He looked at me, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Respect. "You said his wedding is in 2 weeks?" "Yes," I replied, my heart starting to beat a little faster. "It seems to me," he said, a grin set to his jaw, "that a man so proud of his alma mater would be honored to have its dean in attendance." And just like that, the trap was set. I sent a formal invitation to Dr. Finch, which he promptly accepted. I told my parents and Julian that I had reached out to the dean's office to share the good news of the wedding, and the dean had graciously offered to attend as a surprise for Julian. My brother was ecstatic. The presence of the dean of his prestigious medical school would be the ultimate status symbol, the perfect jewel in the crown of his perfect day. He preened. He boasted to Charlotte's family. He saw the dean's attendance as confirmation of his own brilliance, his own importance. He had no idea he was celebrating the arrival of his own executioner. I, his simple, embarrassing sister, had handed him the shovel, and he had eagerly dug his own grave, which brought us back to the ballroom. Julian finished his toast, basking in the applause. He kissed Charlotte, a perfect cinematic kiss for the photographers. The band began to play a soft interlude. The MC, a slick professional hired by the Brennans, stepped back up to the microphone. "Thank you, Julian, for those beautiful words," he said. "Folks, we have one more surprise toast this evening. A very special guest has joined us to honor the groom. He is a titan in the world of medicine, a man of immense integrity, and the esteemed dean of the Northwood University School of Medicine. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alistair Finch." A wave of impressed murmurs swept through the room. Charlotte's father, a man who valued prestige above all else, looked positively giddy. Julian's chest puffed out so far I thought the buttons on his tuxedo might pop. He stood up, a look of triumphant bliss on his face, and applauded louder than anyone. He caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, patronizing wink, as if to say, "See? This is the world you can't comprehend." I just smiled back, a calm, placid smile. Dr. Finch walked to the podium. He was a picture of academic dignity. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd, his gaze eventually settling on Julian. "Thank you," he began, his voice calm and authoritative. "I am here tonight on behalf of Northwood University. An institution is defined by many things: its history, its faculty, its contributions to society. But above all, it is defined by its integrity, by the character of the individuals who bear its name." Julian beamed, nodding in agreement. "The medical profession, more than any other, is built on a sacred trust," Dr. Finch continued, his tone becoming more serious. "The trust that a physician's knowledge is earned, that their credentials are sound, that their moral compass is true. The Hippocratic Oath is not merely a tradition, it is the bedrock of that trust. First, do no harm." The room was silent, captivated. This was more than a simple wedding toast. "It has recently come to the university's attention," Dr. Finch said, his eyes locking directly onto Julian's, "that this trust has been broken. We have received incontrovertible evidence that the academic cornerstone of Dr. Sinclair's acceptance into his surgical residency, a research paper on neuroplasticity, was an act of profound academic fraud." A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Julian's smile froze, then melted from his face, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. Charlotte's hand flew to her mouth. My parents looked utterly confused, as if they'd misheard him. "The work was stolen," Dr. Finch stated, his voice ringing with clarity and conviction. "Plagiarized from the research of a Dr. Anja Schmidt in Germany. It was a theft of intellectual property and a betrayal of the ethical standards Northwood University holds sacred." He let the words hang in the air. Julian started shaking his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. "No," he whispered, his voice inaudible to most, but I could see his lips move. "That's not true." "Furthermore," the dean pressed on, his voice devoid of malice but full of cold, hard fact, "we have uncovered that this was not a new issue. The university's previous administration was aware of academic misconduct by Mr. Sinclair and chose to handle it internally with fines and probation rather than expulsion. This was a grave error. An error we are now correcting." He looked from Julian to the horrified faces of the Brennan family, then to my parents, who now looked like they were going to be sick. "As of this morning, the American Journal of Medicine has been notified and will be issuing a full retraction of the fraudulent paper. The National Residency Board has been contacted and is opening a formal investigation that will result in the immediate termination of his residency placement. And, as dean, acting with the full authority of the university's academic board, I am here to state that Northwood University officially and permanently rescinds the Doctor of Medicine degree conferred upon Julian Sinclair. He is not a doctor, and he never will be." He placed his notes on the podium. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a single sharp sob from my mother. Julian stood there, a statue of broken arrogance. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the horror of total public annihilation. He looked at Charlotte, who stared back at him with dawning revulsion. He looked at her father, whose face was a thundercloud of fury. Finally, his desperate, pleading eyes found mine across the room. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply held his gaze, and in that moment, he knew. He knew that his simple sister, the one who lived in a world he couldn't comprehend, had been the architect of his destruction. I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was over. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Charlotte's father, a man who did not tolerate public embarrassment, had security escort Julian and my parents out of the ballroom within minutes. The wedding was over. The marriage was annulled by the end of the week, the Brennans using their considerable legal power to erase the entire event from history. Julian was a pariah. Stripped of his degree, his residency, and his future, he was also saddled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loans he now had no way to pay. The medical community is small. The story of his spectacular downfall, embellished with every telling, spread like wildfire. No other school would touch him. No research institution would hire him. He had built his entire identity on being Dr. Sinclair, and now that name was worthless. My parents tried to call me, first in anger, then in desperation, begging me to fix it. I didn't answer. Their crime was not just enabling Julian, it was their willing blindness. They had seen my sacrifice not as a gift of love to be cherished, but as my designated function in the family. They had erased me long before Julian had tried to. There was nothing left to say. I used my meticulously kept ledgers and bank records to file a civil suit against Julian for the full amount I had given him, plus interest, under the terms of our verbal contract. With his reputation in tatters and no money for a decent lawyer, he never even showed up to court. I won the judgment by default. I knew I would likely never see a dime of it, but that wasn't the point. The point was the public record. The point was the truth, legally and irrevocably affirmed. My sacrifice was not a gift. It was a debt, and one he had spectacularly defaulted on. Thank you for watching this story about a sister's sacrifice and a brother's ultimate betrayal. Family betrayal cuts deep, but you don't have to face it alone. Support exists. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is document the truth and wait for the right moment. Subscribe to Sweet Retribution, hit that hype button to boost this video, and if you want to support what we do, the membership link is below. Share this with everyone who needs to remember that the truth doesn't need to shout. 1 year later, I was sitting in a different kind of hall, not a ballroom, but a lecture hall. I was a first-year law student. My apartment was still small, but it was quiet, and it was mine. I paid my tuition with a combination of scholarships and traditional student loans, a debt I was proud to incur because it was for my own future, not someone else's. I occasionally heard things about Julian. He was working for a medical supply company, a glorified delivery driver. My parents had moved to a small town a few states away, living in quiet shame. I felt a pang of sadness for the family we could have been, for the brother I once loved, but it was a distant, theoretical grief. The person he had become was a stranger to me. My prized possession was no longer the black ledger book of payments made to him, but the new one I kept for my own class notes. One was a record of a life given away. The other was the blueprint for a life being built. Julian once stood in a room full of people and called my life simple, something he couldn't comprehend. He was right, in a way. He couldn't comprehend a life built on honesty. He couldn't comprehend that quiet work, done consistently and with integrity, builds a foundation that can't be shaken. He had built a glittering facade on a foundation of lies, and it had crumbled to dust at the first touch of truth. He once said, "I lived a simple life." He was right. It's simple, it's honest, and it's mine.